guys. Good morning.
Hey, Rika, how you doing?
Morning.
Are you going to run the PowerPoint, Rika?
I can do, yes.
And we'll just say next slide or whatever.
Slides. Sorry?
I'm Eddie Gain. I'm not Miriam Hernandez. I'll try my best to look like her, but I'll fail miserably. So what I'll do, Rika, is try and make you the host, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
That might be best, yeah.
Yeah, it says
Thank you for doing it. It says you're the host now? Excellent.
Yes.
And Phil had sent a message saying he was going to kind of set the stage, give a few opening remarks, and then pass to you. Is that still the plan?
Yes, and then Stu will also say a few words towards the end.
Oh, that's right. Perfect.
We've got a set of slides which we've divided into 3.
Excellent.
So Phil's going to introduce the context, Rika will talk about the paper, and then I'll talk about the policy impact. Are you actually swigging a beer there, Eddie? You're living up to your Aussie.
I am.
What time of day is it?
It's 5:50 p.m. So I think it's legitimate.
So you've been drinking for a couple of hours already, then?
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I pick up the kids from school at 3 p.m. So my day is finished then. So I feel like I'm actually many hours into the evening.
Yeah, know what it's like.
Rika, where are you based?
In Newcastle in the UK. So I've just had this. Not
I don't know whether you know UK accents, Eddie, but Rika comes from a part of the world where everyone speaks with a very strong accent called Geordie. But because
actually, I'm German. I don't come from here at all.
I know, but that's what I was about to say. Because she's German, she has this extraordinary mixture of Germanic and Geordie, which is utterly unique.
Yeah, you were about to blow my mind because you're like, well, I was going to say I definitely didn't pick her as someone from the UK. So that's I'm glad you clarified. You're in London, Stu, or Cambridge?
Cambridge, yeah. Just outside, a little village 2 or 3 miles away. How many people have you had joining these webinars on average?
Well, I haven't been on the last couple, but Mark Schwartz was telling me there've typically been 30 or 40 people, sometimes a bit higher.
And is it a relatively new thing? I'm not sure.
Totally new. I think you guys are number 4 or 5. It's something SCB just wanted to try. So it's Mark Schwartz kind of volunteered. He was keen to have just a more dialogue about papers and give authors other chances to engage. We used to do kind of a video. I don't know if you might remember. I think you had papers at Conservation Letters when we did it, but we did sort of a video update with a editor's choice paper. But as Wiley cut back their editorial support, we sort of ran out of staff to do that, and so SCB was looking for ways that they could fill some of that gap.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. And does Conservation Letters and why you don't have any sort of media team or communication support now for promoting papers or anything?
Well, we do, but it's just a bit ad hoc. So at Conservation Letters, we have a social media editor, but it's a voluntary position. And then Wiley has their own marketing team, but it's pretty generic sort of staff. And conservation biology is in kind of a different boat because of the way the way it's organized with Wiley. So conservation letters and conservation science and practice are similar in that Wiley kind of provides the editorial support for the journal, and whereas conservation biology, Wiley basically passes all the money to SCB, but they have to organize all the editorial systems and support too, which has some benefits because they really get to control the quality of that and the personnel that are involved in it.
Yeah, yeah. And has SCB sort of talked about getting a media team to promote some of the papers and stories in their journals?
Yeah, they would like to. I mean, I think SCB, like most societies, is just stretched. You know, they've only got a handful of staff in their executive office, and they do have a communications person, but I think there's just a limit to what they can do under the current model. So things like this are all part of SCB trying different things, thinking of different ways they can get more exposure for papers in the journals.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Okay, and it looks like it's already recording. Cool. Well, the SCB team is going to clip this to the start of the presentation.
No, we don't yet have Phil.
He just sent an email saying he has some laptop issues and is hoping to join very soon.
Good.
It does seem as the host, I need to admit everyone who joins. So I wonder if I should make someone else the host, because if I'm talking, I might not be able to see when people try and join.
Oh, sure. Do people all go into, I thought once the meeting started, everyone wouldn't go into the waiting room, but are you seeing a lot of people in a waiting room, are you?
Yeah, I have to like admit everyone seemingly who's joining.
It's really annoying when that happens, isn't it?
That's odd. Yeah, I'm not sure. Feel free to pass it back to me. Maybe I can even take it back.
I think I can make you co-host and then we can probably both do it.
Okay. That'll be better.
I guess it's a safeguarding thing, so you only let in people that you know, but obviously I don't know everyone who signed up anyway. So I'm letting everyone.
Yeah. I don't have a better plan than that.
Yeah, anyone who's ever written a bad review for you or rejected a paper, that's it, don't let them in.
Yes, Phil.
Oh, there you go. Phil is here.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it looks like I can admit people as co-hosts, so I'll keep an eye on that.
Oh, Phil's down at the beach. That's why he was a bit delayed.
Morning, folks.
Oh, hey, Phil.
Morning.
We'll give it a couple of minutes. I think we need to kick off right at 8 a.m. GMT. Geez, the admit button is awfully close to the reject button. You could easily make a mistake doing that. About on my screen, there's about a millimeter between those two. Phil, where is that a photo of?
It's the beach adjacent to the Coto Doñana in Spain.
Nice.
Which I think was the protected area. Kind of the cause around creating that led to the creation of WWF, I think.
Oh, was it?
I think so.
So was Peter, what was the connection to Peter Scott? I thought he was instrumental in setting up WWF.
Yeah, it was the story I read was largely Guy Mountford, I think, his role in that.
Guy Mountford, did you say?
Pardon?
Sorry, I didn't catch the name.
Guy Mountford.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Hi, for all those folks just signing on now, we're just going to give it one more minute as people log on, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, why don't we kick off? I'll continue to admit people. I'm sure others will join. I gather these have typically had 30 or so people joining, and this was such a great paper. I'm expecting the audience to be even bigger. It is the middle of the night in the US, though, so for everyone on there, Carly, we are recording this. So if you don't want to be recorded on video, please turn your video off. If you're happy to occasionally have your face seen, then that's fine. Leave it on. And this will be posted up on the SCB website in due course. So welcome to this kind of SCB Emerging Issues Seminar. And just before everyone joined, I was chatting with Stu and Rike about this. And this is, I think this is the fourth one SCB has done. And it's something we're really trying as a way to get greater engagement and exposure to some of our papers. And what we did as editors were editors of each of the SCB journals. So that's Conservation Letters, Conservation Science and Practice, and Conservation Biology. We each picked a small number of papers from the journals that we thought would make great candidates for this sort of discussion with the authors. We reached out to them. We were lucky enough that the authors of this paper were willing to join us. So what I'm going to do is pass over initially to Phil McGowan, and then I believe he's going to set the stage and then pass on to the lead author, Friederike Bolam, and then I think we're going to bring it home with Stu Butchart. So you're getting kind of 3 times the value for your money tonight. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Phil. Now, Phil, do you have slides that you need Rike to bring up, or?
Yes.
I think I have all of them.
The whole slide deck.
Excellent. And for everyone on the call, feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box. I think Phil and Rike and Stu are going to talk for a bit over half an hour, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers. So we'll monitor the chat box. So feel free, if something comes to mind, to put it in the chat box, and we'll work through those once they finish their presentation. So thanks, Phil. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Eddie, and thanks very much for selecting the paper. It was certainly challenging and great fun to produce this, and thanks to you and SCB for helping us get this out. in time for it to really have a bit of policy impact that Stu will talk about right at the end. So as you say, I'm just really going to set out the scene. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Rika. So the Convention on Biological Diversity a decade ago adopted a strategic plan for all of the countries that had signed up to the CBD, which is all world governments apart from the USA, a very ambitious strategic plan. It had 5 strategic goals to do with tackling drivers and pressures and assessing the status of biodiversity, looking at the benefits from biodiversity, and then figuring out how we might put all of that into practice. So the goal that we're going to have a look at a little bit, one of the targets in goal C, which is improving the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. And that's reflecting the 3 levels of biodiversity that are written into the CBD's convention document. So the next slide, please, Rika. Underneath those 5 goals, there are 20 targets, and there are 3 of them for goal C, improving the status of biodiversity. So 1 notionally around ecosystems, although it's actually to do with the mechanism, protected areas. 1 to do with preventing extinctions and the status of threatened species, which is the one that we're going to have a look at. And then 1 that was perhaps intended to be about genetic diversity, but really looks at the genetic diversity of species that are important for agriculture. So that's the scene. There are 20 of these targets, and you can begin to see that tackling and seeing a significant change in those targets in goal C really does rely on improvements in the targets towards reducing direct pressures and assessing the underlying causes of biodiversity. But nonetheless, if we can go to the next slide, please, Rika. Nonetheless, there was a great deal of excitement in 2010 when this pretty ambitious target for species was adopted. So by 2020, the extinction of known threatened species had been prevented, and their conservation status, particularly of those most in decline, has been improved and sustained. So perhaps we as ecologists might look for a slightly different wording, that these are politically negotiated targets, and it was nonetheless a pretty ambitious global statement. So if we can, that's the target that we're really talking about here. So by the midterm review, so published in the Convention on Biological Diversity's document, Global Biodiversity Outlook 4, the midterm review in 2014-15 sort of broke that target down into 2 components, saying that there had been no real progress on preventing the extinction of known threatened species, considering further extinctions more likely, and perhaps more worrying, considering that the conservation status of species most in decline has been improved. That was actually moving away from the target. So despite successes, the pressures on species were increasing and more species were showing signs of deterioration in their extinction risk assessment, and more species were expected to deteriorate as well. So there was particular concern 5 years ago about this one target, the 2 components of this one target. If you could move on to the next one, please, Rika. So despite that, when we began to get more involved with working with the CBD Secretariat and parties on this 5 years ago, we did want to draw attention to the fact that there were successes. So while these indicators were not really showing significant change, we could, on a relatively perhaps modest scale, show some successes. So the work that the top study there, the extinction of 16 bird species avoided over that decade up to 2004, which is work that Stu led, that's work that we really wanted to build on and provide a much more comprehensive picture that would really make a significant contribution to assessing this one target. So a number of species there that have either seen an improvement in their conservation status, the status would have been much worse without conservation action, or populations that have benefited. So we know that we can do something about species that are highly threatened or on the verge of extinction. Next one, please, Rika. So a couple of years ago, the IUCN Species Survival Commission set up a task force to try and contribute towards both trying to assess progress for the species target before 2020, but also trying to input into negotiations in whatever might come afterwards, as is called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So the Species Survival Commission is the largest of IUCN's commission in terms of its members. Over the 4-year cycle that the commission operates, membership varies from sort of 7,000 to 10,000 members. We, at the time we got these figures, we were represented in 173 countries and had quite a significant academic membership to more than 2,000 members in 130 countries. So also indicating that many members are drawn from botanic gardens, zoos, conservation organisations, so a wide range of entities that are heavily involved with species and their conservation. The task force comprises 21 members. It's got very strong regional representation and diverse species, and also species expertise, and also some of those areas that we need to be aware of, such as invasive species, conservation genetics, conservation planning, those kinds of areas. So we're drawing widely on the SSC membership. Next slide, please, Rika. So inputting into this task force, into the reporting on the 2011 to 2020 strategic plan, and also what comes next to it, our real sort of the boiling down, the essence of our work has been inputting into the IUCN position, responding to consultations from the CBD Secretariat, and proposals on what might come after this present strategic plan. As I've mentioned, we draw in expertise from across SSC, and the two particular pieces of work that we wanted to undertake. One is you'll hear about this morning, the work that Rika has led. And then there's a second piece of work which we're hoping will see the light of day in the new year, developing a threat-based approach to addressing species extinction risk. Those are our key pieces of work and how we're locked into this policy negotiation. So the next, I think there's just a couple of final scene setting slides now. So just to show this rather a busy slide, but it is the IPBES report from last year. I've mentioned that target 12 is broken down into two components, which are within that red box in the middle, but all 20 targets are broken down into 55 components. And the IPBES assessment, the overall scorecard, and I think Stu might give a bit of an update on what was the final scorecard in GBO5, Global Biodiversity Outlook 5. But when we were in the middle of undertaking this work, we could see that the indicators for the target 12, extinctions prevented, were really very worrying. Very little progress was deemed to have been made in May of last year. So a worrying state. So finally, just indicating, if you can move on to the next slide, please, Rika. The timescales now, because adopting the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we should have been meeting around now in Kunming in China to adopt that framework. It's been put back for a year. So hopefully there is time for the lessons that come out of this paper to feed into what ambition there might be for setting the Global Biodiversity Framework targets or outcome goals around the conservation status of species and what we can achieve if we really put our mind to avoiding extinctions. So I'll hand over now to Rika to talk about the guts, the main part of the study.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So I'm going to talk about our actual paper a little bit now after Phil set some of the context. So we've heard about the CBD and we've heard about the HE targets, but despite these agreements, species have still been going extinct. So I've got some examples on this slide. There was the Chinese paddlefish, which was last spotted in 2003. The Christmas Island pipistrelle, which was last seen in 2009, so that counted as an extinction since the HE targets came into force. And another paper on bird extinctions, mainly in South America, that are driven by deforestation. And so we know that species have gone extinct, but what we wanted to investigate was how many more species would have gone extinct without conservation action during both of these timeframes. So since the CBD came into force in 1993, and also since the HE targets came into force in 2010. More species would have gone extinct, or how many extinctions have we actually prevented over those timeframes? Apparently my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can hear me now. And we also wanted to then compare that to the actual number of extinctions. And we focused on 2 taxonomic groups for this, so on birds and mammals. And that's mainly because we needed to have a lot of information on the species that we included to actually make this assessment. And birds and mammals tend to be the best studied groups. So you have other groups where some species might be quite well studied, but maybe not the entire group, and that would have made it quite difficult. So how did we go about it? So in a nutshell, we came up with a short list of species that we thought maybe conservation action has prevented their extinction. We found a lot of information on these species, and then we did an expert elicitation exercise. So the experts had to answer the question, what is the probability that conservation action prevented extinction in species X? So I'm going to talk you through this in some more detail now. So we basically started off with all bird and mammal species, which is about 17,000. And then of those, we only considered any species that were very close to extinction since 1993. And the first step to identify those really is by using the IUCN Red List, where species are classified according to their extinction risk. So we narrowed it down to those species that are either critically endangered or endangered with very small population sizes. So that gave us about 630 species. And if you've ever looked on the Red List website, you know there was a lot of detail in each of the assessments. And so we went through the assessments of all of those species. And we ended up with a short list of 81. This was quite a long process, and there were separate teams involved with making the assessments. So if we weren't quite sure whether we should include a species or not, we tended to include those species. But essentially, they needed to be sort of close to extinction at some point since 93. So not necessarily in 1993, but any point since then as well. And there needed to be some conservation action that seemed like it made a difference for the species as well. And that was our short list. So we then compiled lots of information on these species and sent this to experts to make sure all of the information was up to date and was correct. And then we undertook this expert elicitation exercise. So we had a separate group of experts for birds and for mammals, and there were also some people who scored both, but essentially an expert for birds would score all of the bird species. And we had some very long Zoom calls where we discussed this then. So every expert rated the species, put their probabilities down. And this was all anonymous. Then we had a Zoom call. We would discuss every species in turn. And because of the number of species, that could take quite a while. And then every expert was asked again to independently and anonymously assess these species. And then we calculated the medians of these results. So I'm going to talk you through some examples of these species now, just so that you get a bit of an overview how this process looked. Okay, I'm going to start with Puerto Rican Amazon, which is a species where we were pretty confident that conservation action prevented extinction. So a 97% probability that conservation action prevented extinction. This is a species that originally only occurred in one population on Puerto Rico. And then through conservation action, a second population was established through reintroduction. And in 2017, there was a devastating hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. And this hurricane wiped out the initial original population of this bird, so that only the reintroduced population remained. So that's why overall people obviously thought, okay, without this reintroduction program, the species would have gone extinct. So that's a sort of very clear example of where people were pretty confident in their assessment. But that wasn't the case for all of the species, and there was quite a range of probabilities, which is kind of the case with the next example, the Iberian lynx. So the Iberian lynx population declined really dramatically. There were over 700 in 1985, and then that declined down to only about 65 individuals in 2001. So very steep decline for the species, and it suffered from quite a, or still suffers from quite a range of threats. So maybe the key one was a decline in their prey source, which are rabbits, and they suffer from disease, and so that population collapsed. But that's not the only threat to the lynx. So you also have things like habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. There are road accidents where they basically get run over, and some in the past these were really threatened by poaching, which is still a little bit of an issue, but not as much as it used to be. And they not only have a range of threats, but also a wide range of actions to try to address these threats. So there are efforts to increase the rabbit population again, and there are translocations taking place, and habitat restoration. And I think because there's such a range of threats and also actions, it's quite hard to sort of see exactly which action has benefited the species the most. But it is on the increase again, and there are about 300 of them now. So they have definitely improved. And I think we can kind of see in this 80% figure that people just weren't quite as sure exactly how it all sort of linked together. And of course, there were also species where we didn't think that conservation action prevented their extinction. And there were various reasons for that. So I've picked the Chinese crested tern here, which is a species that is mainly threatened by egg collecting, which really led to a collapse of the population. And then a ban was introduced on collecting their eggs, which then meant that the population really increased again because this ban was also enforced. So it's definitely a positive conservation story. However, it then turned out that there was actually also a population of the species which never received any conservation action. And so in our assessment, we thought, okay, well, if this one population didn't actually receive any action and it's still there, then the species wouldn't have gone extinct completely over these time frames that we were looking at, even though obviously conservation has massively benefited the species. So that gives you a bit of an overview over some of these species that we're looking at and how we came to the conclusions, really. And overall, I need to try and move this little window over my screen. So overall then, since 93, we found that there were 21 to 32 bird and 7 to 60 mammal extinctions that have been prevented. And this range in the numbers really indicates that probability I've shown you. So we saw that anything above 90 had a very high probability that extinction has been prevented. So that's the smaller number, and then the larger number is anything above 50%. So we were less certain about those species, but still overall conclude that probably conservation action has prevented extinction. So that was since 93. So again, since the CBD came into force, and then since 2010, so since the HG targets, we found that there were 9 to 18 bird and 2 to 7 mammal extinctions that have been prevented. And this number is smaller mainly because a species is much less likely to go extinct over only 10 years compared to the longer time frame of 27 years. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics of the species that we found conservation action prevented their extinction. And these are all the species since 1993 that I'm considering in these. So where are they? So this is the map for the birds. Most of these are either in New Zealand or in Brazil. So those are the countries with most of these species. And I've shown you earlier that there were quite a few bird extinctions in South America as well. So I guess because South America is very diverse in terms of birds. So you have quite a few extinctions, but you also have quite a few prevented extinctions. But the threats are slightly different. So in Brazil, it tended to be more about habitat loss or hunting, whereas in New Zealand, the key threat, I guess, is invasive species. So this varies a little bit between different regions in the world. And the map does look slightly different for mammals. So for birds, we have basically some on pretty much every continent. For mammals, it's slightly different. It's also a slightly smaller number. So most of these are in China. A lot of those species were threatened by habitat loss, which has been, well, stopped or averted to a point where the species have benefited. And then a few in the US as well. And the other key kind of threat to the mammals often is hunting. And I'm going to show you some of the key actions now, but essentially legislation to stop hunting is really key for mammals. So this is information we've summarized from the red list. So you can find lots of information, but one of them is which conservation actions are actually being implemented for the species. That's what I've summarized here. Now, we didn't assess whether the individual actions were all effective or not. So that wasn't really the purpose of this paper. So it's really an account of which actions have taken place for some of these species. But it's quite clear that if you look at the sort of legend, you have land and water protection and management are these kind of darker blue colors, and those feature quite heavily both for birds and for mammals. It also includes invasive and problematic species control. So I mentioned for birds, quite a few were in New Zealand, where that was a key threat. So obviously one of the actions to address that was also very important. And I mentioned legislation for mammals, but that gives you a little bit of an overview over some of these actions. Okay, so then we put these numbers that we had also into the context of the actual extinctions. And I've only written or put the numbers for 93 on the slide. So the extinction rates would have been 3 to 4 times greater without conservation action. And I think that's really our key result. If you just look at the numbers themselves, maybe they don't look all of that, they don't look that big, but really if you think about it in the context of what could have gone extinct, how many species we could have lost, and all of that, then I think the 3 to 4 times greater is quite significant. I want to say a couple of things on that actually. So our paper was specifically about which extinctions have been prevented, but not so much about which species have been saved. So a lot of the species that I talked about and that we listed in our paper, they really aren't saved. Some of them are still very close to extinction. So while this is obviously a really positive result, the work doesn't sort of end here. There is still a lot of work to be done. And the second thing is that we can't really precisely say whether the extinction rates, the extinction rate would have been greater since 2010, but because there is a time lag in actually finding out when an extinction has occurred, it's kind of difficult to say what this rate would have been since 2010. There haven't been many extinctions recorded since then, but it's likely that over the next decade or so, more species will be declared extinct. But if we take these kind of rates that occurred between 93 and 2009, and if we apply that, the number of extinctions, and if we apply that to the time frame since 2010, then actually the extinction rates would be pretty similar, so probably 2 to 4 times greater without conservation action. Okay, so this gives you a bit of an overview over our paper, and I'm going to hand over to Stu now.
Thanks, Rika. Mindful of the time, I'm going to rattle through these last slides reasonably swiftly. So the main, and I'm going to talk about, what was the policy impact of this work and where have we taken it subsequently. So the main policy process we were trying to feed into was the Convention on Biological Diversity and their flagship report, the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which Phil mentioned. The fifth one of these was released in September of this year, and it provided the official verdict on whether the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets that were adopted in 2010 were met. Next slide. The GBO had 3 main sections. Rika, if you can move on, thank you. Focusing on the importance of biodiversity for sustainable development, and also looking at pathways for the future, but the main section focused on assessing progress for each of the 20 targets. And for each one, the CBD compiled indicators, information from the scientific literature, and national reports from each of the parties, each of the countries that are parties to the CBD, that they provided to the Secretariat. Next slide. Next slide, Rika, if you could. Thank you. And for each target, scored them on a 1 to 6 point scale. And this shows the overall results across the 20 targets. And the different coloured slices show the different components of each target. So each target often addressed multiple aspects of biodiversity, or the threats to them, or the actions needed. Overall, none of the 20 targets were met in full. Just 6 targets were partially achieved, and only 7 out of 60 of the components across the 20 targets were met. That's basically an 88% failure rate, so pretty dismal record. Next slide. For target 12, our evidence played a key role. So this shows the layout for target 12, and you can see that our results estimating the numbers of extinctions prevented and the impacts on extinction rates formed a prominent part of the narrative assessing how the world did in achieving or attempting to achieve target 12. Next slide, please. The report also identified 10 areas of good news across the 20 targets amongst this fairly dismal record. 10 areas showing particular progress over the last decade. And the 6th of these drew heavily on the work that we published in this paper, showing that conservation action had reduced extinctions. Next slide. And this report, the GBO5, and our findings that fed into it, set the context now for negotiations between the world's governments to adopt a new plan, which is being called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, for the next decade, containing the goals and targets for tackling biodiversity loss. And as Phil mentioned, this process is being delayed by the COVID-19 crisis, but is still continuing. So the latest draft of the post-2020 plan, next slide, includes 4 goals for outcomes that we would like to see by 2030. And the first of these includes ecosystems and addresses the conservation of threatened species with a couple of milestones, one of which again focuses on threatened species and the abundance of species. If you click next, and we've just had another paper accepted in Conservation Letters, led by Brooke Williams, arguing that there are a number of problems with this milestone, the wording of this goal, and proposing that, if you click next, the wording is modified, in particular to incorporate a renewed commitment to halt human-induced extinctions. So this was something that the government signed up to in 2010. It's been dropped from the current draft of the post-2020 framework, and we think that is a deficiency, and our work showed that extinctions can be prevented, and this commitment should be retained in the post-2020 plan, and we provide arguments and evidence for that. Next slide. So as well as 4 biodiversity goals, there are 20 targets again, a whole suite of them addressing threats that need to be mitigated. But the 0 draft of this plan didn't include any target about promoting the actions needed to enable species to recover, and that would be essential in order to prevent human-induced extinctions. Mitigating threats isn't enough for many species. So various NGOs and others, some of the parties, argued that we needed a target along these lines to be introduced, and the latest draft has now added such a target, target 3, and another paper by Rika argues that the wording of that target needs strengthening further, and you can see here what we've proposed, and retaining target along these lines, improving and strengthening the wording to promote actions that will support the recovery of species in order to prevent extinction of the most threatened ones. Last slide, please. So to summarize then, our work showed that species can be saved from extinction where sufficient effort and political will and resources are applied. And this has had a major impact on bird and mammal extinction rates over recent decades. And we think this is a really important finding amid all the doom and gloom of the twin biodiversity and climate crises that we're living through. There's an awful lot of bad news out there, justifiably so, but it's important to assess, better understand, communicate and raise awareness of these conservation successes, so that both the public and decision makers realise that we do have the tools to turn this around. And we hope these results will inspire world leaders to adopt an ambitious goal with an ambitious plan with robust goals and targets for saving nature in the next decade. And as the current COVID-19 crisis shows, our health, as well as that of the planet, depends upon this. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Stu and Phil. And apologies, it's dark here now, and you can probably hear cicadas in the background. But you know, one of the reasons why I was so enthusiastic about this paper and very pleased the authors sent it to Conservation Letters is that I work for the Nature Conservancy when I'm not editing this journal, and we often push our key donors on the reasons why they support us, and it's sometimes hard for them to articulate, but when it comes down to it, it's often about engaging directly in reducing extinctions, and they haven't they often haven't thought about it beyond really anecdotally. Most of the discussions of extinction reduction is sort of vignettes of particular species. So I gotta say, personally, I really enjoyed this paper. I was pleased to see it come out and have found it particularly useful in my professional career. So without delay, they guys were terrific on timing. So we have about 20 minutes nearly for questions. So I wanted to open the floor. Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question of the authors. If you would prefer, you can also put it in the chat and we'll read it out from there. If not, I've got one to kick off while we're waiting. I was curious how you chose 90% as that does seem like very high confidence, but I think you could have been more generous even. Why settle on 90%?
Well, it's arbitrary, of course, but we picked. We wanted to capture the range of uncertainty, and picked 50% as a sort of a lower threshold to give the upper bound to the estimate. So for those species, it's more likely than not that the species would have gone extinct without action. And then for a more, we wanted to pick a pretty stringent threshold for the upper bound, the lower number, and chose that value to mirror values that we'd applied in an earlier piece of work, trying to assess the probability of whether particular species had gone extinct or not. So this was a paper we published in Biological Conservation, assessing quantifying the probability that species have gone extinct on the basis of the threats to them, the timing and reliability of records, and the timing and adequacy of surveys. So we picked the same thresholds to match the ones we used in that study. But yeah, they are arbitrary, but to try and capture the range of uncertainty. I don't know whether Rika wants to add anything to that response.
No, I was trying to remember what the paper was that we based this on. I knew it was one of yours, so I'll let you answer the question, really.
Maybe just to add to that, then one of the other ways in which you can try and use the uncertainty captured by these probabilities is, rather than just totting up the number of species above particular thresholds, 50 and 90, is to sum them across all species, including the ones of lower probability. And we did that as well and presented those results, and the estimates were broadly consistent with the ranges that we gave.
What have you found the reaction to be to those numbers? Impressed or concerned, or somewhere in the middle?
There was a fair bit of media interest in the particular examples. I think the absolute numbers don't sound terribly impressive, but as Rika said at the towards the end of her part, when you compare it to the actual extinction rates, you know, over a pretty short period of time, a decade or a few decades, it does rather put it into context that we're you know, potentially halving or more the rate of extinction. So I think from that perspective, it is more impressive. And I think as we were referring to earlier, given the overall picture is so bad, you know, it's pretty desperate failure of society as a whole and governments in particular to meet these targets that were met. There's considerable interest in the fairly rare examples of successes that we can point to, and as you were saying, there's not much quantification of this. So certainly the CVD Secretariat were very pleased to get these results in time, and it was they who particularly encouraged us not to just look at the last decade and the ICHE targets, but look at the whole lifetime of the CVD. And obviously, the longer period you look at, the easier it is to be confident that these hypothetical counterfactuals of what would have happened in the absence of conservation, it's easier to be confident about saying particular species would have gone extinct or not. So yeah, the CVD were very pleased to get these results and to incorporate them into their analysis.
If I could just jump in there, Eddie, it's the only paper that was actually cited in the CBD's press release for GB05. So there were a number of stories, but when the comment on extinctions avoided or the extinction rate would have been higher without conservation action, they actually cited this paper. So it's the only one. So as Stu said, amidst all the gloom, you know, there was a lot of relief, not necessarily thinking on the actual numbers, but the rate of extinction would have been much higher. So I think politically they were really pleased to get some positive news.
I just want to add to that as well, because I saw some people putting our numbers into context of the estimated 1 million species that are threatened. And then, of course, it doesn't look very impressive. But I don't really think that is at all a fair comparison, because clearly we were only looking at 2 taxonomic groups, whereas the 1 million threatened species estimate is supposed to be representative of all species. So that's the first issue with that. And the other one is that we only looked at species that were really close to extinction. So the 1 million estimate, again, that would include species that are vulnerable, for example, and we didn't look at any vulnerable species. So I think some of these comparisons aren't particularly useful. So just to add to that, because I saw a few people kind of compare that, and I don't think that's a good comparison at all.
Yeah, one of the things we didn't do was to ask, well, what were the collateral benefits of the efforts for these you know, few dozen species, and it'd be interesting to quantify how many other birds and mammals, and where we know it, other taxa benefited from the same action. So the eradication of invasive species has almost certainly saved some of these things from going extinct, but it's also allowed the recovery of native ecosystems on various islands around the world, and that certainly had knock-on consequences for the other native species in those places, and in some cases even beyond. You take out the rats and cats, that leads to the seabird populations recovering. They are then transferring nutrients to the marine environments offshore, and then that's having substantial knock-on consequences for marine ecosystems well beyond the terrestrial context. So that would be another interesting avenue to explore to broaden the comparisons here.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat box. Carly, do you want to ask yours directly? No, I can just read it out. I don't know if you can see that.
Sorry, Eddie, I'm masked up walking the dog, so I don't know if you can hear me clearly.
No, that's fine. I'll read it out.
Okay, thanks. I was just really a question around cost. So whether you were able to think about what it costs to save these species from extinction?
It's a very good question. Phil, do you want to take that on? Which we did indeed take that a bit further.
Yes, yeah, we have. It wasn't part of that key study, the study that Rika's talked about, because we were primarily interested in that assessment of extinctions that had been avoided. But we have had a master's student really try to ferret out what those costs might be, and she did a fantastic job, but it's not a comprehensive picture because these costs don't seem to be, well, they're not recorded by those taking the action. And there are two sources of information she looked at. We did try to contact as many people as we could that had been part of the original study and then snowballed a bit out from them to be in contact with people who'd actually been directly involved with the work. And then for some of those species that are particularly those who've been part of long-term projects, there is something written down either in, if it's California condor, there's plenty of US Fish and Wildlife Service and other kinds of reports. So there's quite a bit of grey and published literature. So she tried to pull that together and did a great job, but there are quite a few gaps in that picture. So coming up with an overall cost of what the amount of money that has been expended. I suppose the other challenge is that there are different actors for some of those species. So making sure that all costs of the actions that have contributed to avoiding extinction are counted and counted only once is a challenge. So be more than happy to talk more about how we can enhance that study, because I think we've got, a pretty good start on that. But it's very challenging to come up with any kind of headline figure. I don't know if Rika, if you've got any more that you think you might want to add from Christina's study.
Well, just I guess that it's definitely important and definitely also very challenging to do. And I guess the sort of take home would be, how can we actually come up with a system where this can be recorded in a way that we can then compare costs later on. I actually think that would be sort of the next step, because if it's so difficult to do that, then maybe we'll need something to outline how this kind of thing would ideally be recorded. Might still not mean that people will do it. But at least if we have some kind of system in place that people can refer to, then hopefully we'll get to a point where it can be done comprehensively and actually be compared as well.
And of course, the interesting thing would be, what are the most cost-effective approaches? And if we have a limited pot of money, what would be the optimal way of spending it to prevent extinctions and help recover species, which I'm sure is what's at the back of your mind asking that question. Clearly, some actions are considerably more expensive to implement than others, but doing so will drive much greater biodiversity returns.
Well, thanks, guys. So we've only got a handful of minutes left, and I want to get to this question from Rigula, which is about I guess whether you uncovered any information or reference anything about the potential collateral consequence of these actions to save species, particularly for local communities.
I don't think we did, but Rika may correct me, in terms of the consequences for local communities of actions addressing hunting. By definition, all of the species we were looking at were incredibly rare during the period we're talking about. So for none of them were they a important source of an important food resource for the local communities that then the conservation actions ceased or blocked, because people could no longer hunt them. Weather efforts to control hunting of the highly threatened species we were looking at also had a consequence for hunting of much commoner species, and whether that had impacts on local communities, we don't have information on. But I would think, off the top of my head, for the examples we're talking about, that wouldn't be the case. Friederike, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. It's obviously slightly different because we had this kind of, we wanted to show for these policy targets what had happened, very specifically only about extinctions. And there is only really one species where I can really remember there was mention of local communities very specifically, but it was in a positive way. I think it was an ibis species. Was it bald ibis maybe in Morocco? Stu, you correct me if I'm wrong. You know the birds better than I do. But I think one of the experts made it really clear that the species really benefited from the local community being involved. I can't remember now all the details, but I remember that this particular expert made it really clear that without the local community involvement, that species probably wouldn't have recovered as well as it had done. So I think it can also kind of go both ways, that on the one hand, the community might suffer, but also the community might help and might also benefit from it then, in terms of things like tourism, I guess. But I think it would be interesting to look at sort of the both ways how it could go.
Yes, I mean, I'd support that. So for a number of these species, the local communities with the prime implementers of the action were very heavily involved in the conservation projects. And as Friederike says, in some cases, they're benefiting from the ecotourism that's focused specifically on these species. And if the species have gone extinct, that ecotourism would have ended. The question there from Charles, no, we didn't look at subspecies. That would be really interesting, and I'm sure there's a whole additional raft and places like Australia that have a considerable focus of conservation efforts on highly threatened subspecies, would, I'm sure, provide additional examples. Do we look at endangered species? So we considered all threatened species, so critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable, but almost by definition, the ones that were the strongest candidates were critically endangered and the most threatened species, because they're the ones that are closest to extinction.
Excellent. Hey, well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you getting up early and hopping on the call and sharing this. And oh, there you go. I guess just a thanks, Stuart. Yeah, and I appreciate everyone tuning in. We'll be sharing this recording on the SCB website. And yeah, please, this is sort of a thank you for you guys for sending it, and please to everyone else to keep on sending us good stuff to Conservation Letters.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to share it more widely.
Have a great day, everyone. See ya.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Eddie.
Bye.
Bye-bye.